In the sleepy, sunlit town of Riverton, where the days unfolded like pages of a well-worn book, 14-year-old Malik Jackson carried a secret heavier than the coins jingling in his pocket. It wasn't just money, it was a promise, a dream forged in the sticky heat of a bakery kitchen, where he'd spent months elbow-deep in flour and frosting. Every cupcake he'd boxed, every crumb he'd swept, every tired smile he'd flashed at customers had led to this moment. Today, under a sky painted gold by a lazy Saturday sun, Malik wasn't just a kid in a faded hoodie, he was a big brother on a mission. His target, a delicate silver charm bracelet from Belmont Jewelers, the kind of place that gleamed with a polish Riverton rarely saw. It was the perfect gift for his little sister Nia's 10th birthday, a shimmering token to make her eyes sparkle the way they used to before life got hard. Malik's sneakers scuffed the pavement as he approached the store, his heart thudding with a mix of excitement and nerves. He could still smell the sugar on his hands from his last shift at Maple Street Bakery, could still feel the ache in his arms from carrying trays heavier than he'd ever admit. The money in his wallet, crumpled bills and a few coins, wasn't much to the world, but to him, it was everything. He'd counted it 100 times, whispering the total like a prayer. Enough for the bracelet, plus a little extra just in case. This wasn't about flash or flexing, it was about Nia, about giving her something to hold onto when the nights got quiet and their mom's overtime shifts stretched too long. He pictured her tiny wrist, the way she'd gasp when she saw the charms, a star, a heart, a little bird angling like magic. The storefront loomed ahead, its glass facade catching the sunlight and throwing it back in dazzling shards. Belmont Jewelers wasn't just a store, it was a fortress of wealth, a place where diamond rings winked from velvet trays and gold chains hung like royalty. Malik had passed it 1,000 times on his way home from school, nose pressed to the window, imagining the day he'd walk inside. Today was that day. He adjusted his hoodie, old but clean, unzipped to show a neat t-shirt underneath, and ran a hand over his short braids. He knew how he looked. Young, black, out of place in a town where folks smiled politely but watched you twice as hard. His mom's voice echoed in his head. "Keep your head up, Malik. You belong anywhere you choose to be." He squared his shoulders, took a breath that tasted like courage, and pushed open the heavy glass door. A soft chime sang through the air as he stepped inside, and the world shifted. The light was brighter here, almost blinding, bouncing off rows of jewelry that cost more than his family's rent. The air smelled sharp, expensive cologne and polished wooden. The silence was thick, broken only by the murmur of well-dressed customers, older women with pearls at their throats, a man in a suit flipping through a catalog like it was a menu. Malik felt their eyes before he saw them, quick glances that lingered too long, sizing him up like he'd wandered into the wrong story. He shook it off, his focus zeroing in on the bracelet he'd memorized from the window display. It sat in a glass case near the counter, silver links gleaming under the spotlight, charms catching the light like tiny promises. That was it. That was Nia's. Behind the counter stood Evelyn Pierce, a woman who looked like she'd been carved from the store itself, sharp-edged, blonde hair pinned tight, eyes cold as the diamonds she sold. She was mid-sentence with another customer when Malik approached, but the moment her gaze landed on him, her words faltered. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers twitched against the counter, and something in her posture stiffened, like a cat spotting a shadow. Malik felt it instantly, that shift, that unspoken question hanging in the air. "What's a kid like you doing here?" He'd seen that look before. Felt that weight pinning him down in grocery stores, at school, even on Riverton's quiet streets. But today wasn't about them. Today was about Nia. He stepped up to the counter, heart pounding but voice steady. "Hi, ma'am," he said, offering a small, polite smile. "I'd like to see that bracelet, please, the silver one with the charms." He pointed to the case, his fingers steady despite the tremor in his chest. Evelyn didn't move. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing as they raked over him, his hoodie, his sneakers, the way he stood there with his hands in plain sight. For a long moment she just stared, and the silence stretched tight enough to snap. Then she spoke, her voice low and edged with something Malik couldn't quite name. "You sure about that, kid? That one's not cheap." Malik nodded, reaching into his pocket slowly, carefully, so no one could mistake it for anything else, and pulled out his wallet. He opened it, revealing the stack of bills he'd folded so neatly they looked like they belonged in a bank. "I've got the money," he said, meeting her gaze. "I've been saving up." He waited for her to soften, to nod, to treat him like any other customer. But Evelyn's eyes flicked to the cash, then back to his face, and instead of relief, her expression hardened. Her lips curled just a little, like the sight of his hard-earned money was an insult. "Where do you get all that?" she asked, her tone casual but sharp as a blade. "You didn't find it somewhere, did you?" The words hit like a slap, and Malik's stomach twisted. He clenched his jaw, forcing his voice to stay even. "I work at the bakery on Maple. I earned it." But Evelyn didn't blink. She leaned forward, her nails tapping the counter, and let out a soft, dry laugh. "Sure you did," she said, her eyes glittering with something dangerous. "I've been here a long time, kid. I know when something doesn't add up." And just like that, the dream Malik had carried through that door, the dream of Nia's smile, of a moment that was his to claim, began to crack. Malik stood there, the cool air of Belmont Jewelers biting at his skin, his wallet still open on the counter like a shield he'd hoped would protect him. The silver charm bracelet glinted in its velvet tray, so close he could almost feel its weight in his hand, but Evelyn Pierce's words had turned the air sour. "I know when something doesn't add up." Her voice lingered, a taunt wrapped in suspicion, and Malik's chest tightened. He wanted to snap back, to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't some thief sneaking in under her nose, but his mom's lessons held him steady. "Don't give them a reason, Malik. Keep it calm, keep it clear." So he swallowed the heat rising in his throat and forced his lips into a tight line. "Can I just see it, please?" he asked again, his voice quieter now, fraying at the edges. Evelyn sighed, a sharp little huff like he'd asked her to climb a mountain. She reached for the tray with exaggerated reluctance, her manicured nails clicking against the glass case as she pulled it free. "Fine," she muttered, setting it down with a thud that echoed in the hushed store. "But don't think I'm not watching you." Her eyes bored into him, twin lasers tracking every twitch of his fingers, every shift of his weight. Malik ignored her, his focus locking onto the bracelet. Up close, it was even prettier than he'd imagined, the star charm catching the light, the heart dangling like a whisper of love. He could already see Nia's face, her gap-toothed grin, the way she'd hug him so tight he'd pretend it hurt. His fingers brushed the silver, tentative but reverent, and for a split second, the weight of Evelyn's stare faded. Then it happened. His hand, still clumsy from nerves, tilted just a fraction too far. The bracelet slipped, tumbling from his grip with a soft clink against the glass counter. Malik's breath hitched as it bounced once, twice, then skittered off the edge, landing on the tiled floor with a sound so small it should have been nothing. But to Evelyn it was everything. Her gasp ripped through the store like a gunshot, shrill and jagged. "I knew it!" she shrieked, her voice slicing the air as she lunged back from the counter. "You little thief! You thought you could grab it and run!" Malik froze, eyes wide, hand still hovering where the bracelet had been. "No, he stammered, bending to pick it up, but Evelyn was already moving, her arm jabbing at him like a spear. "Don't you dare touch it!" she snapped, her face twisting into something pharaoh-red cheeks, wild eyes, a snarl that bared her teeth. "I saw you. You were about to shove it in your pocket." The lie hit Malik like a punch, knocking the air from his lungs. He straightened, shaking his head fast. "I didn't. I wasn't," but his words drowned in the chaos she unleashed. Evelyn spun to the counter, snatching the phone with trembling hands, her voice booming into the receiver. "Police! Get to Belmont Jewelers now. I've got a kid here, black hoodie, about to rob me blind." She slammed the phone down, whirling back to Malik with a smirk that oozed triumph. "You're not getting away with this," she hissed, folding her arms tight across her chest. "I've seen your kind before, sneaking in, thinking you can take what's not yours. Not on my watch." The room tilted. Malik's pulse hammered in his ears, a frantic drumbeat drowning out the murmurs of the customers around him. He felt their stares now, heavier than ever, the woman in pearls clutching her purse, the man in the suit stepping back like Malik was a bomb about to blow. No one spoke up. No one questioned her. They just watched, their silence louder than Evelyn's screams. "I didn't do anything," Malik said, his voice cracking, raw with a mix of fear and fury. "It slipped. That's all." But Evelyn laughed, a dry, bitter sound that scraped his nerves raw. "Sure it did," she mocked. "Tell that to the cops when they haul you out of here." The wail of sirens cut through the distance, sharp and growing louder, clawing at the edges of Malik's calm. His hands shook at his sides, his mind racing. He knew this sound, had heard it on the news, in stories his mom told late at night when she thought he wasn't listening. Stories of kids like him in places like this where a mistake wasn't just a mistake, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. He wanted to run, to bolt through that glass door and disappear into Riverton's golden streets, But his feet wouldn't move. Running would make it worse. Running would make it true. So he stood there, a 14-year-old boy in a hoodie, pinned by a lie he couldn't out-talk. The door burst open with a rush of hot air, and 2 cops stormed in, boots stomping, badges flashing, the weight of their presence sucking the oxygen from the room. The first, Sergeant Hargrove, was a wall of a man, gray hair bristling under his cap, eyes hard as stone. His hand snapped to his holster, yanking out his gun and leveling it at Malik's chest before the door even swung shut. "Hands up now!" he bellowed, voice like thunder, the barrel steady and black and way too close. Malik's stomach dropped, his arms shooting up so fast they ached. "I didn't," he started, but Hargrove cut him off, stepping closer, the gun an inch from his heart. "Shut it, kid. You think you can pull this crap and walk away?" Behind him, Officer Reynolds hesitated, younger and leaner, his hand hovering near his own weapon but not drawing it. His eyes flicked from Malik to Evelyn, a flicker of doubt creasing his brow, but he stayed silent. Evelyn pounced, pointing at Malik like he was a fugitive she'd hunted down. "That's him," she cried, her voice shrill with fake panic. "He tried to steal it right in front of me. I caught him red-handed." Hargrove's jaw tightened, his finger twitching near the trigger. "You got anything to say, punk?" he growled, the gun unwavering. Malik's mouth went dry, his breath shallow and ragged. The store spun around him, the lights too bright, the air too thick, the gun too real. He could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, the sting of tears he refused to let fall. Nia's face flashed in his mind, her laugh, her trust, the bracelet he'd never get to give her now. "I didn't steal anything," he managed, his voice small but fierce, trembling with the weight of holding it together. "Call my mom." Hargrove snorted, a harsh bark of a laugh. "You'll call whoever you want from the station, kid." But Malik shook his head, his hands still high, his eyes locked on the gun. "No," he said, louder now, the word cutting through the chaos. "Call my mom now." Evelyn rolled her eyes, stepping forward with a sneer. "Oh, please," she scoffed, her voice dripping venom. "What's she gonna do? Cry about rights? Yell about justice? Save it for the sob story, kid." The sirens faded, but the tension didn't. It coiled tighter, a spring ready to snap, and Malik stood at its center alone, accused, a gun at his chest, and a dream for his sister slipping through his fingers like sand. He didn't know how this ended. He didn't know if he'd walk out that door. But he knew one thing. His mom was coming, and when she did, this store wouldn't be ready for the fire she'd bring. The air in Belmont Jewelers crackled, thick with the metallic tang of fear and the low hum of a standoff teetering on the edge. Malik Jackson stood frozen, his skinny 14-year-old arms trembling as they stretched toward the ceiling, the cold barrel of Sergeant Hargrove's gun hovering inches from his chest. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, a frantic rhythm drowning out Evelyn Pierce's smug taunts and the rustle of customers shrinking into the shadows. The silver charm bracelet lay abandoned on the floor, its tiny star charm glinting faintly under the harsh lights, a mocking reminder of the dream that had brought him here, now twisted into a nightmare. "I didn't do anything," he repeated, his voice a hoarse whisper, barely audible over Hargrove's heavy breathing and the creak of his grip tightening on the trigger. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his square jaw twitching with impatience. "Keep talking, kid," he growled, stepping closer, the gun's muzzle brushing the fabric of Malik's hoodie. "Makes no difference to me, or you going down either way." Behind him, Officer Reynolds shifted uneasily, his hands still poised near his holster, his sharp gaze darting between Malik and Evelyn. Doubt flickered in his expression, but his silence was as damning as Hargrove's aggression. Evelyn stood triumphant, arms crossed, her blonde hair a stiff halo around a face flushed with righteous fury. "I told you," she snapped at the cops, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "He's a thief, caught him slipping that bracelet right off the counter. You gonna let him talk his way out of this?" Malik's throat burned, his words tangling in a knot of panic and rage. He wanted to scream, it fell. "I didn't take it," but the gun held his tongue hostage. His eyes flicked to the door, praying for a miracle, for someone to see the truth in a room blind to it. The customers stared, their faces a gallery of fear and judgment, a woman in pearls clutching her bag like a lifeline, an older man muttering under his breath, his head shaking in quiet condemnation. No one moved. No one spoke. And then, just as Hargrove's finger twitched toward the trigger, the glass door exploded open with a force that rattled the chandeliers. A woman strode in, her presence a storm breaking over the room, tall, unyielding, her navy suit crisp as a blade, her heels striking the tile like war drums. The air shifted, bending under the weight of her authority, and every head snapped toward her. She held up a badge, its gold catching the light with a flash that silenced the chaos. "I'm Dr. Regina Jackson," she announced, her voice low and lethal, slicing through the tension like a knife. "Chief of Police, Riverton PD." Her eyes, dark, fierce mirrors of Malik's own, swept the scene, landing on her son with a flicker of pain that hardened into steel. "And that," she said, pointing at Malik, her fingers steady as stone, "is my son." The room imploded into silence, a vacuum so deep it sucked the breath from Malik's lungs. Hargrove faltered, the gun dipping an inch, his broad shoulders stiffening as recognition hit. Reynolds exhaled sharply, his hand dropping from his holster, his face paling like he'd just stepped off a cliff. Evelyn's smirk vanished, her mouth falling open, then snapping shut as her eyes widened in a mix of shock and dread. For a heartbeat, no one moved, the weight of Regina's words pinning them all in place. Then she stepped forward, her heels echoing in the stillness, and the spell broke. "Sergeant," Regina said, her gaze locking onto Hargrove, her tone calm but laced with a fury that made the air tremble. "Explain to me why my 14-year-old son, unarmed, buying a gift for his sister, has a gun pointed at his chest." Hargrove's mouth worked, but no sound came out at first. He lowered the weapon slowly, his knuckles widening around the grip, his voice gruff when it finally emerged. "We got a call, reported theft. We responded." "Responded?" Regina cut in, her voice rising like a whip. "You responded by storming in here, skipping questions, and aiming a loaded weapon at a child? My child." She took another step, closing the distance, her presence towering despite Hargrove's bulk. "Did you check his story? Did you look at the evidence? Or did you see a black kid in a hoodie and decide that was enough?" Hargrove's jaw clenched, his eyes darting to Evelyn, but he said nothing, the accusation hanging heavy between them. Evelyn jolted forward, her voice shrill and desperate. "He tried to steal it," she insisted, pointing at the bracelet on the floor. "I saw him dropped it on purpose, was about to run off with it. I had to call." Regina's head snapped toward her, and Evelyn's words choked off mid-sentence. The chief's gaze was a blade, peeling back every layer of Evelyn's bravado until she stood exposed, small and shrinking. "You saw him," Regina repeated, her tone dangerously soft. "Or you assumed. Because I'm guessing you didn't bother with facts before you dialed 911 and turned a shopping trip into a crime scene." Malik's arms ached, still half raised, but he didn't dare lower them, not yet. His mom's voice was a lifeline, pulling him from the edge, but the fear still coiled tight in his gut. He watched as Regina turned back to Hargrove, her expression unreadable but her eyes blazing. "Where's the security footage?" she demanded. Hargrove hesitated, glancing at Reynolds, who cleared his throat awkwardly. "We were about to," he started, but Regina's hand slashed the air, cutting him off. "No, you weren't," she said, her voice a quiet roar. "You were about to cuff my son and drag him out of here without a shred of proof. So let's see it. Now." Her command brooked no argument, and the store manager, a wiry man who'd been hovering uselessly in the background, scrambled to comply, disappearing into the back with a muttered apology. Evelyn's face twisted, her hands balling into fists. "This is ridiculous," she sputtered, her voice pitching higher. "I don't need a camera to know what I saw. You can't just." "I can," Regina said, turning to her with a look that could have shattered glass. "And I will. Because if that footage doesn't show exactly what you claim, Miss Pierce, you're not just Rangieri finished." The threat hung in the air, cold and final, and Evelyn's defiance cracked, her lips trembling as she shrank back. The manager returned, fumbling with a small screen, and the room held its breath as the footage played. There it was in grainy black and white, Malik at the counter, polite and steady, showing his money, the bracelet slipping from his fingers, a clumsy accident, not a theft, his startled flinch as it hit the floor. No grab, no pocket, no crime, just a kid trying to buy a gift. The silence that followed was deafening, a weight that crushed Evelyn's lies and left Hargrove staring at the floor, his gun now limp at his side. Regina exhaled a slow, controlled breath, then turned to Malik. Her eyes softened for the first time, a flicker of relief breaking through the steel. "Lower your hands, baby," she said quietly, and Malik obeyed, his arms dropping like lead, his chest heaving as the tension drained out of him. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder, firm and warm, grounding him in the chaos. Then she faced Hargrove again, her voice low and deadly. "So, Sergeant, what happens now? You still want to arrest him?" Hargrove said nothing, his jaw ticking with frustration, his authority unraveling in the face of hers. Evelyn opened her mouth, a last gasp of protest, but Regina's glare silenced her before a word could escape. The room watched, breathless, as the storm Malik's mother had brought began to reshape everything, and the fight was far from over. The silence in Belmont Jewelers hung heavy, a fragile shell cracked open by the truth flickering on the security screen. Malik Jackson let his arms fall fully now, the ache in his shoulders a dull echo of the terror that had gripped him moments before. His mom, Regina Jackson, stood beside him, her hand still firm on his shoulder, a tether keeping him steady as the room reeled. The silver charm bracelet lay untouched on the floor, its delicate charms dulled by the shadow of what had almost happened. Sergeant Hargrove's gun was back in its holster, his broad frame slumping as he avoided Regina's piercing gaze. Officer Reynolds rubbed a hand over his face, his earlier doubt now a quiet regret etched into his frown. Evelyn Pierce stood frozen behind the counter, her one smug face drained of color, her hands twitching like she wanted to claw back the power she'd lost. Regina's voice broke the stillness, low and deliberate, each word a hammer striking steel. "So, Sergeant Hargrove," she said, turning her head just enough to pin him with her stare, "are you going to cuff my son now? Or do you need another look at that footage to remind you what evidence looks like?" Hargrove's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek, but he didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the floor, then to Reynolds, as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Regina didn't wait for a reply. She stepped forward, her heels clicking with purpose, and faced Evelyn head-on. "And you," she said, her tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You turned a dropped bracelet into a 911 call, put a gun in my son's face, all because you couldn't see past your own prejudice. Tell me, Miss Pierce, what exactly were you so sure of?" Evelyn's lips parted, a shaky breath escaping, but no defense came. Her eyes darted to the customers still watching, still silent, then to the manager, who shrank behind the counter like he could vanish into the woodwork. "Two thoughts," she stammered, her voice thin and brittle. Regina tilted her head, her expression unyielding. "You thought wrong," she said, cutting through the excuse like a blade. "And that thought could have ended my son's life. So I hope you've got more than stammering when this hits the news, and trust me, it will." Malik watched, his chest tight, as his mom's words landed like blows. Part of him wanted to cheer, to see Evelyn crumble under the weight of her own lies, but the other part, the part still shaking from the gun, still raw from the stares, just felt hollow. He'd walked in here for Nia, for a bracelet, for a moment of joy, and instead he'd gotten this. A room full of people who'd rather see him in cuffs than a checkout line. Regina squeezed his shoulder, sensing the shift in him, and turned to Hargrove one last time. "We're done here," she said, her voice final. "But don't think this ends with you walking away. I'll see you at the station." Hargrove nodded stiffly, a begrudging acknowledgement, and motioned to Reynolds. The two cops headed for the door, Hargrove's boots dragging like he carried the weight of his mistake, Reynolds casting a quick, almost apologetic glance at Malik before disappearing outside. Evelyn stayed rooted, her hands gripping the counter, her eyes wide and unblinking as Regina guided Malik toward the exit. He paused at the threshold, glancing back at the bracelet on the floor, one last look at the dream he'd fought for. "All I wanted was to buy it," he said, his voice low but steady, loud enough for Evelyn to hear. "That's it." She flinched, a tiny crack in her facade, but said nothing as the glass door swung shut behind him. Outside, the Riverton sun still burned bright, the golden afternoon mocking the storm Malik had just survived. He followed Regina to her car, a sleek black sedan parked crookedly from her rush to get inside. The air felt lighter here, but his legs wobbled as he slid into the passenger seat, the adrenaline finally crashing out of him. Regina sat beside him, her hands gripping the wheel, her knuckles pressing white against the leather. For a long moment neither spoke, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. Then she turned to him, her chief's armor softening into a mother's worry. "You okay, baby?" she asked, her voice gentle now, searching his face. Malik stared at the dashboard, his fingers tracing the seam of his jeans. "I don't know," he admitted, his throat tight. "I keep seeing that gun. Hearing her call me a thief. All those people just watching." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. I thought when you showed up I'd feel better. Like we won. But I don't. I just feel tired. Regina's eyes darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She reached out, cupping his cheek, her palm warm against his skin. You shouldn't have to feel anything but safe in a store, Malik, she said, her voice cracking just enough to betray her own pain. You didn't win a battle today, you survived one. And I'm so damn sorry it's a fight you even had to face. He nodded, leaning into her touch, but the words didn't erase the weight in his chest. Regina pulled her phone from her purse, her movements sharp and deliberate as she dialed. Cynthia, she said when the line picked up, her tone snapping back to steel. I need a press release out tonight, Belmont Jewelers, full details. Launch an investigation into Hargrove's conduct in that 911 call. I want a public statement on racial profiling and make sure Evelyn Pierce's name is front and center. This isn't slipping under the rug. She paused, glancing at Malik, her eyes softening again. And get me the owner of that store on the line. My son's getting that bracelet one way or another. Malik's head jerked up, surprise cutting through the fog. Mom, he started, but she held up a hand, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You earned it, Malik. Not just the money, the strength to stand there and not break. Nia's getting her gift. She hung up, the car falling back into silence, and Malik felt something shift, a small spark of warmth piercing the cold exhaustion. It wasn't victory, not fully, but it was something. 3 days later, the story broke like wildfire. News vans swarmed Riverton. Headlines screaming about racial profiling and police overreach. Belmont Jewelers' Yelp page drowned in one-star reviews, whispers of boycotts buzzing through the town. Evelyn Pierce was on leave, though insiders said she'd been quietly fired. Her name, a stain the store couldn't scrub off. Hargrove faced an internal review. His body cam footage showing that gun inches from Malik's chest leaked to the press, sparking outrage. Regina made good on her promise. The bracelet arrived in a velvet box, delivered by a sheepish store manager who couldn't meet Malik's eyes. That night, Nia bounded into the living room, her squeal piercing the quiet as she waved her wrist. Malik! Look what Mom got. The silver charms danced under the lamplight, star, heart, bird, exactly as he'd pictured. She threw her arms around him, her hug fierce and messy, and for the first time in days Malik smiled. You picked it, right? She asked, beaming up at him. Yeah, he said, his voice soft. I picked it. She didn't need to know the rest, not yet. For now, her joy was enough to hold on to, even if the weight of what he'd endured still lingered. Heavy as the gun he couldn't unsee. The living room glowed soft under the flicker of a single lamp, casting long shadows across the worn couch where Malik Jackson sat. His knees pulled up, his hoodie still zipped tight like armor he couldn't shed. The TV murmured in the background some late-night news segment about Belmont Jewelers, the words racial profiling and investigation floating through the air, but Malik barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on Nia, sprawled on the rug with a grin that lit up the dimness, her small wrist flashing with the silver charm bracelet he'd fought for. She dangled it above her face, giggling as the star charm spun, catching the light like a tiny beacon. Malik, look, it's like magic, she chirped, rolling onto her side to beam at him. You're the best brother ever. Malik forced a smile, the edges of it shaky but real. Yeah, glad you like it, Nia, he said, his voice quieter than he meant it to be. She didn't notice, too caught up in her treasure, but the weight in his chest pressed harder. He'd wanted this moment, her joy, her squeal, the hug she'd given him when she first slipped the bracelet on. It was why he'd saved every penny, why he'd walked into that store with his head high. But now, watching her, he couldn't shake the shadow clinging to it. The gun in his face, Evelyn's sneer, the silence of strangers who'd let it happen. That bracelet wasn't just a gift, Anna Marie, it was a battle scar. A story he'd carry long after Nia outgrew it. Regina stepped in from the kitchen, a mug of tea steaming in her hands, her suit jacket swapped for a sweater that softened her edges. She paused, watching Nia play, then settled onto the couch beside Malik, her presence steady as always. She hasn't taken it off since it got here, she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You did good, baby. Malik nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, fingers tracing the frayed hem of his sleeve. Yeah, he muttered. Guess so. But the words felt hollow, and Regina heard a crack in his voice, the echo of something unresolved. She set the mug down, turning to face him fully, her eyes searching his. Talk to me, Malik, she said, her tone gentle but firm, the chief giving way to the mom. "You've been quiet since it all went down. What's going on in there?" She tapped his temple lightly, a gesture she'd done since he was little, and it cracked something open in him. He exhaled, sharp and shaky, and the words spilled out before he could stop them. "I keep thinking about it, Mom. That gun, how close it was. How she looked at me like I was nothing. And all those people. They didn't care. They just stood there." His voice broke and he swiped at his eyes, angry at the tears he couldn't hold back. "You fixed it, and I'm glad, but what if you weren't there? What if there wasn't a camera? What happens next time?" Regina's face tightened, pain flashing across it before settling into something fierce and tender. She pulled him into her arms, her hug strong and unyielding, the kind that had held him through storms before. "I don't have all the answers, Malik," she said, her voice low against his ear. "I wish I did. What happened to you's wrong, it's ugly, and it's bigger than any one of us. But you listen to me." She pulled back, cupping his face so he had to meet her gaze. "You're not nothing. You're my son Nia's brother. A kid who worked his heart out for something good. They don't get to define you, not Evelyn, not Hargrove, not anyone. You keep being you and we keep fighting. That's how we win." Malik swallowed hard, her words sinking in, heavy but warm, like a blanket he didn't know he needed. He nodded, leaning into her for a moment longer before pulling away, his shoulders a little straighter. "Okay," he said, quieter now, but there was a spark in it, Maul, fragile but alive. Regina squeezed his hand, then stood, picking up her phone from the coffee table. "Good," she said, her tone shifting back to steel. "Because I'm not done yet. Hargrove's review's tomorrow, and I'm making sure he answers for that gun. Evelyn's out, but the store's still scrambling. IVE got a meeting with their lawyers in the morning. This doesn't end here." He watched her dial, her voice crisp as she barked orders to her team, and something settled in him, not peace, not fully, but a kind of strength he could borrow from her. The news droned on. Belmont Jewelers stock plummeting, protests planned outside the store, calls for reform echoing through Riverton's quiet streets. It wasn't just their fight, Anna Marie, it was bigger, louder. A ripple he'd started without meaning to. He glanced at Nia again, her laughter cutting through the noise, and the bracelet gleamed like a promise kept. It wasn't the ending he'd imagined when he'd pressed his nose to that glass window months ago, but it was something proof he could stand up, even when the world tried to knock him down. Later, as the house quieted and Nia curled up asleep with the bracelet still on, Malik sat by his window, staring out at Riverton's dark skyline. The golden glow was gone, replaced by a scattering of stars, and he wondered how many other kids were out there, facing their own Evelyns, their own Hargroves. He didn't have the power his mom did not yet, but he had her fire, her lessons, her voice in his head. "Keep being you." The bracelet had made it to Nia's wrist, but the fight it carried lived in him now, a quiet flame he'd carry into tomorrow. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. Weeks had passed since the chaos at Belmont Jewelers, but Riverton still buzzed with the echoes of that Saturday afternoon. The air carried a new edge now, whispers in the coffee shops, protest signs stacked against park benches, and newsstands plastered with headlines about reform and accountability. Malik Jackson, now a quiet fixture in those conversations, walked through it all with his hoodie up and his hands shoved deep in his pockets. The silver charm bracelet was safe on Nia's wrist, a victory he clung to, but the weight of what it had cost him lingered like a bruise that wouldn't fade. At 14 he felt older than he should, his steps heavier, his eyes sharper, scanning the world for the next Evelyn Pierce or Sergeant Hargrove waiting to pounce. Home was his refuge, a small house on the edge of town where the paint peeled but the walls held strong. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange, Malik sat at the kitchen table, his math homework abandoned beside a half-eaten sandwich. Nia danced around the room, her bracelet jingling as she twirled, humming a song only she knew. Regina was at the stove, stirring a pot of chili, her phone buzzing incessantly with updates from the precinct. The news had settled. Hargrove was officially suspended, his badge under review after the body cam footage sparked a state investigation. Evelyn Pierce had vanished from Riverton, her name a ghost haunting the shuttered Belmont Jewelers, now boarded up and plastered with for sale signs. Justice, it seemed, had teeth and Regina had sharpened them. But Malik's mind wasn't on the headlines. It drifted to the letter in his backpack, the one he hadn't shown anyone yet. It had arrived that morning, slipped into his locker at school, its envelope plain but heavy with possibility. He'd read it a dozen times, the words burned into his brain, and now, as Nia's laughter filled the room, he pulled it out, smoothing it flat on the table. Regina glanced over, her spoon pausing mid-stir. "What's that, baby?" she asked, her voice casual but her eyes narrowing with that chief's instinct she couldn't turn off. Malik hesitated, then slid the letter toward her. "It's from some people at school," he said, his tone guarded. "They heard what happened. They want to do something about it." Regina set the spoon down, wiping her hands on a towel as she took the letter. Her brows lifted as she read, and a slow, surprised smile crept across her face. "A student coalition," she said, looking up at him. "They're asking you to join, talk about profiling, push for changes in town." "Malik, this is big." He shrugged, but his fingers fidgeted with the edge of the paper. "I don't know," he muttered. "I'm not a leader or anything. I just wanted to get Nia that bracelet." Regina sat across from him, sliding the letter back, her gaze steady. "You think that's all you did?" she asked, her voice low but fierce. "You walked into that store a kid with a dream, and you walked out a spark that lit this town up. People saw you." Malik saw what happened and couldn't look away. "That's not nothing." Nia bounded over, peering at the letter with wide eyes. "Are you gonna be famous, Malik?" she teased, poking his arm. He rolled his eyes, a real laugh slipping out despite himself. "Nah, just maybe help out or something." But as Nia giggled and darted off, Regina's words sank deeper. He thought of the gun, the stairs, the way his mom had stormed in like a force of nature. He thought of the kids at school who'd started nodding at him in the halls, the ones who'd whispered, "That was messed up," like they'd seen it too. Maybe it wasn't just his fight anymore. The next day, Malik stood in the school gym, a folding chair creaking under him as a dozen other students, some he knew, some he didn't, gathered in a loose circle. The girl who'd written the letter, Aisha, stood at the front, her braids swinging as she paced. "We've all got stories," she said, her voice ringing clear. "Cops following us home, teachers assuming stuff, stores acting like we're trouble before we even say hi. What happened to Malik? It's not just him. It's us." She glanced at him, a quick nod that felt like a hand reaching out. "So we're starting here. Meetings, petitions, maybe even a march. You in?" Malik's throat tightened, the room's eyes on him like a spotlight. He saw Evelyn's sneer in his mind, heard Hargrove's growl, felt the cold metal of that gun ghosting his chest. Then he saw Nia smile, the bracelet gleaming, his mom's fire burning steady. He took a breath, his voice shaky but growing stronger. "Yeah," he said, sitting up straighter. "I'm in." A murmur rippled through the group. Agreement, excitement, a spark catching flame, and Aisha grinned. "Good. Let's make some noise." That night, Malik lay in bed, the letter folded on his nightstand, the faint jingle of Nia's bracelet drifting from her room next door. Riverton slept outside his window, its quiet streets hiding battles he was only starting to understand. He wasn't a hero, not yet, maybe not ever, but he wasn't alone anymore. The bracelet had been for Nia, a promise kept against all odds, but what came after was for him, for them, for every kid who'd felt that shadow fall. His mom's words echoed, "Keep being you and we keep fighting." He closed his eyes, the flame she'd lit in him flickering brighter, and for the first time since that day, he felt it might just be enough to carry him forward. And so Malik Jackson's story didn't end with a bracelet or a protest. It stretched into something bigger, something that rippled through Riverton, and maybe even beyond. That 14-year-old kid who just wanted to make his sister smile, stumbled into a fight he never signed up for and came out swinging, not with fists, but with a quiet kind of courage that's louder than it looks. Today, in a world where phones catch every injustice and hashtags can spark revolutions, Malik's tale feels less like fiction and more like a mirror. We've all seen it, someone judged before they speak, someone cornered by a system that's too quick to pull the trigger, literally or figuratively. Maybe it's the kid at the mall, the coworker in the break room, or even us, caught in a moment where the world decides who we are before we get a say. Here's the funny part. Malik probably thought heroes wear capes or badges, not hoodies with cupcake crumbs in the pockets. Turns out the real superpower's just showing up messy, scared, and all because when you do, you give others permission to stand up too. So, lesson of the day? Don't underestimate the guy with the jelly-stained sneakers. He might just change the game while you're busy scrolling X for the next viral rant. What about you? Ever had a moment where you turned a small stand into a big noise? Drop it in the comments. We're all ears for a good story. Oh, and before you bounce, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Malik's only the start. We've got more tales coming your way, full of heart, grit, and maybe a few more bracelets worth fighting for. Stick around, you won't want to miss what's next.